Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be watching from. I'm Jay Levinson, the director of MoMA's International Program, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first session in this year's CMAP seminar series, Transversal Orientations 2. CMAP, which stands for Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives, is a research initiative started at MoMA in 2009 that promotes the in-depth study of art histories outside North America and Western Europe. It's currently made up of 3 groups composed of over 60 staff members from 16 of the museum's departments, which focus on modern and contemporary art in Africa, Asia, and Central and Eastern Europe. Research on Latin America at the museum, which was originally carried out by a 4th CMAP group, has been very capably taken over by the Patricia Phelps Cisneros Research Institute for the Study of Art from Latin America. Each CMAP group is led by 1 or more senior MoMA curators, who are assisted by graduate or postgraduate fellows. The curators are Stuart Comer, Kara Maines, Smooth Zewi, and Roxana Markoch. The fellows are Nancy Dantas, Inga Lassa, and Wang Binghao. The groups invite scholars, artists, and curators to lead monthly workshops on their specialties at the museum, although this year they're currently being conducted virtually, and organize also annual research trips to obtain firsthand knowledge of the areas they are studying. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the 2 principal sponsors of the program, MoMA's International Council and Agnes Gund. The CMAP Fellows edit our online publication, Post, Notes on Modern and Contemporary Art Around the Globe, which is the public face of the research program. They also organize on an annual basis collaborative seminars among all the groups, helping members to think more deeply about how the museum might best address the global view of art. The topics of past seminars have included performativity, transnational histories and non-aligned networks, multiple modernities, international networks, global collecting practices, and challenges of museum display. The seminar for this year is entitled Transversal Orientations 2, building on the ideas generated last year in part 1, which invoked transversalism's potential for envisioning alliances and surpassing oppositions. This year's seminar will further explore and annotate the transversal as a methodology for working between geographical borders and beyond disciplinary and epistemological silos, while also acknowledging the challenges of such an approach in our fractured solipsistic present. The seminar will take place in 2 sessions, today and tomorrow. In preparing the seminar, our 3 CMAP fellows were joined by Madeline Murphy-Turner, formerly the CMAP Fellow for Latin America. I'd now like to pass the microphone to my colleague Carson Chan, the inaugural director of the Emilio Ambas Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and Natural Environment at MoMA, and a curator in the museum's Department of Architecture and Design. Carson will introduce the first of this year's seminar sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to reflect on the panel. As Jay said, I'm Carson Chan, the director of the Emilio Ambas Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and Natural Environment here at MoMA, and a curator in the museum's Architecture and Design department. I make exhibitions, organize panel discussions about environmental issues, support research and publishing. But I would say that much of my work is really about thinking through the friction between how we live within institutions and how we live on the planet. What structures, physical and systemic, have we built around us? In what ways do they assist our personal and collective lives? And in what ways do they actually impede our ability to live together, to coexist? Yesterday, I saw one of our speaker, Daniel Lee's exhibition at the New Museum here in New York City. In the museum's lobby gallery, tucked within the building's minimalist concrete floors and white walls, Daniel's installation appears like an anomaly, a hanging assemblage of jute hemp fabric, ropes, and straw hay bales slattered with mud containing seeds and spores. Thousands of white and golden wildflowers are strung in a giant garland from the rafters. Terracotta ceramic vases, some hanging, some on the ground, are covered in fabric, preserving whatever's inside of them. Mushrooms have fruited along the underside of these mud fabric wrote objects. Cloth colored with turmeric hanging above head echo the color of the flowers. The work, called Unnamed Entities, speaks of processes, of things that change and age, of decay, transformation, and new life, of materials coexisting in novel combination, of the irrelevance of singularity in the presence of community. But as Daniel draws our attention to the life worlds that mold, rot, and sprout within our controlled environments, I thought about how the museum itself must be considered within the ecology of the work. The gallery lights, the off-gassing from the white wall paint, the mechanized circulation of filtered air are no less part of the ecology of mud, spores, flowers, and mushrooms. As environmental philosopher Steve Vogel argues, the human world is the natural world. Any proposition for biodiversity must include the world of humans, our institutions, our cultures, societies, our hubris. And by we, I mainly mean the so-called Western world. Similar thoughts emerged when I read the introduction to our other panelist, Juno Salazar Pareña's book, Decolonizing Extinction, the work of care in orangutan rehabilitation from 2018. In telling the stories of Sarawak's 2 wildlife centers, we learn of the intricate and inextricable entanglement between humanity and the world we have occupied. Juno asked questions that also surfaced when I was amidst Daniel's seeds and spores. Who is living? In what ways are we in relation with them? What constitutes selves in these relations? And to what obligations are we committed? In Juno's book, I learned that colonization, extractive practices like illegal logging, post-colonial urban development, scientific research, and tourism all determine the way wild and semi-wild orangutan are treated at this moment at the precipice of their extinction. For Juno, quote, decolonization is to be oriented towards process and experimentation and not towards a foregone conclusion, except for the need to care enough about others, including and in particular non-humans others. Decolonizing extinction requires a serious reconsideration of the current norms and practices around how we share this planet, unquote. In their recent book, sociologists Bram Boucher and Robert Fletcher argues that mainstream ideas in environmental conservation, the kind that largely harbors the foregone conclusions Juno warned us about, are, quote, not adequate to save nature in the Anthropocene, Capitolocene, or simply the 21st century, unquote. Instead of the so-called fortress conservation, where large swaths of land are protected from any human disturbance, except of course tourism, Boucher and Fletcher advocate for what they call convivial conservation, a form of conservation that does not separate humans and nature, a way of seeing the world that understands a museum's air circulation system as an agent in the commingling of pollen and spores, and the regulating of temperature, humidity, and the conditions that allow mushrooms to grow. Convivial, literally meaning living with, strikes a non-moralistic procedural tone for a way forward. But what does it mean to live with today's world? How do we live with a climate crisis? How do we live with a pandemic? As the tragic news from Texas hangs heavy on our minds this morning, how do we live with policies and perspectives that are counter to the very prospect of living with each other, of conviviality? Again, thank you to Bing, Inga, and Madeline for the opportunity to think together this morning. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Juno.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. I am zooming from Gaya Kahuna Homelands, and my original motivation for studying orangutan rehabilitation was the question of how to build social relations across species and across millions of years of evolution away from each other, especially when orangutans are famous for being the least social of all great apes. The framing of my question was departing from the prevailing emphasis on proximity between humans and apes. As Donna Haraway has famously shown in her book, Primate Visions, the family of man expressed over evolutionary time is a nexus for cultural values about the nuclear family, and with it, ideas of gender, race, and class. Instead of adding to her work by continuing to unpack ideas of sameness and familiarity within the family of man, I instead wanted to think through difference. Difference is vital to the particular social relations fostered at rehabilitation centers, where everybody has particular life histories that span years and decades, each impacted by colonial histories. The social relations generated between these subjects are fleeting and can unfold over microseconds, yet they bridge over millions of years of evolutionary geological time. In a way, these encounters show a collapse of multiple timescales from minutes to millennia. Prior to fieldwork in Borneo, I assumed that I'd look at implicitly gendered and culturally specific questions about adoption across species and what forms of intimacy came with it. What I witnessed and experienced compelled me to think about a much larger question, one that occupied a planetary scale. How do we live and die in this present age of extinction when colonial legacies impact chances for survival? I addressed this in my book that Carson so nicely, generously summarized. Decolonizing Extinction, the Work of Care in Orangutan Rehabilitation. It shows that a space literally carved by colonialism, particularly forestry and agricultural industrialization, decolonizing possibilities nevertheless erupt in the form of social relations across species between humans and apes, and that these transspecies social relations are deeply gendered and racialized. What I see as their decolonizing potential is the embodiment of vulnerability that happens at these sites, even as these sites function as privatized hospices for dying species. To carry out this study, I devised a transdisciplinary method that uses animal behavioral sampling methods from field-based biosciences, alongside a more familiar toolkit from the humanities and social sciences, the tools of ethnographic participant observation, interviews, discourse analysis, and archival research help me find empirical information from which to generate social theory. My empirical evidence compelled me to think about the ways both orangutans and the people who care for them were caught in the same trap. I call this trap arrested autonomy, insofar that the institution of the Orangutan Rehabilitation Center, just like the state of Sarawak within the Federation of Malaysia, was set up for future freedom, but active efforts to instill that freedom functions in a way to almost guarantee continued dependency. In short, arrested autonomy is about indefinitely deferring independence. Today, with more hindsight, I want to revisit a problem that continues to vex me. My problem is that uncertainty is treated as a problem, as something to reject or correct. Yet it underlies any social relation that emerges when two strangers who do not speak the same language or depend on the same visual or audio cues need to depend on each other to survive together. I think about the problem of uncertainty as I consider a question posed to us today by the CMAP fellows. The question is, how can we utilize a transversal perspective amid our present day reality in which right-wing nationalist leaders have come to power, borders have been fortified, and dialogical exchange often seems to be insufficient or even unattainable? I write with Southeast Asia in mind, where democracy is seemingly more aligned with the epistemic kind instead of the kind of democracy that's associated with people's power. The concept of epistemic democracy in science studies names the rejection of expertise that some scholars fear have opened up floodgates for far-right, post-truth conspiracy theories. The era of strong men never really ended in Malaysia. In the Philippines, this month's election of Bongbong Marcos is serving as a lesson that epistemic democracy flourishing on social media paves the way for right-wing authoritarianism. The fear among human rights activists and intellectuals is that the younger Marcos will erase the paper trail that documents his father's kleptocracy and murderous regime. What is being framed as epistemic democracy, that a whole range of wild ideas are proliferating at this moment, as if all these ideas are valid, opens up potential to actively disprove truth and evidence and make plausible perspectives invalid. Under these circumstances, the stakes of certainty are high. Thus, I ask myself, how can we retain uncertainty while also retaining a grounded sense of truth, reality, and evidence? The orangutan who I call Lisbeth helps me think about the connections between uncertainty and what is perceived as its opposite, such as truth, evidence, and reality. When I met 8-year-old Lisbeth, she grabbed hold of a watermelon slice behind her on the platform below, ate a few bites, and then threw it at me, nearly hitting my head, and climbed away to the large plastic barrel that acted as a substitute nest. This wasn't the last time that I was on the receiving end of one of her projectiles. From there on out, our encounters often entailed me looking at her, glancing at my wristwatch, and jotting notes in timed intervals between 1 to 5 minutes. She would look at me standing erect on her limbs so that her hand-like feet curled to support her entire weight, which is a feat considering how orangutan bodies are adapted to live in trees instead of the ground. She would either spit or lob whatever seemed convenient. These banal humiliations characterized our relation, one that was intrinsically unequal. These encounters filled the notebooks I carried with me. And while these gestures could easily be interpreted as rejections of social engagement, Their very acts maintained our sociality. It too worked as an invitation insofar that it evoked a bodily reaction on my part, a weak laugh, sigh, and lopsided smile rolled into one gesture. These encounters grew to characterize our uneven rapport of my interest in what seemed like her dislike, but not her disinterest. And this is what characterized our pigeon, our nonverbal nor haptic, but nevertheless embedded in shared space, and with it smells, sights, and sounds of our shared presence. Lisbeth's captivity and her apparent eagerness for human social contact had been a source of embarrassment. Her behavior strayed far from the aspirational ideal held by the Forestry Corporation and Forestry Department regarding semi-wild orangutans. Ideally, they would climb trees, were primarily arboreal, and sought human contact only in order to eat if hungry. Such a way of being required training. These training sessions entailed a person bringing her along an hour-long trek up to the forested hill to the ranger station and have her freely move through the trees. Lisbeth, however, spent the week-long session surrounded by kilometers of forest, entirely on the ground and near the Iban men who accompanied her to the ranger station. When the Forestry Corporation biologist, an Iban man with a master's in biology, yelled at her while pointing up to the tree canopy, hoping to compel her to climb up and act like an orangutan, Lisbeth slapped him right in the face. This story underscored for me the lesson that Lisbeth's world required us to have the courage of humiliation, of willingly accepting projectile spits, stones, or slaps. Such an embrace of vulnerability and uncertainty is the means through which perspectives can broaden, in which our prior certitude is fundamentally shaken. The staff biologist on the receiving end of Lisbeth's face slap had a different analysis than my own. For the biologist, it was an issue of the influence white people's desire for affection had upon Lisbeth and other orangutans held in captivity at the site. Between the ages of infancy to 5 years of age, Lisbeth spent it caged away from her mother and subjected to the adoring affection of visiting white tourists. Lyung, the subcontracted worker who was acknowledged as the real, although unofficial expert on site, had relayed the story of the staff biologist to me with pleasure and parodied the overconfidence with which the biologist spoke. Yet Lyung too concurred with the biologist's thoughts. For Lyung, it was an issue of Lisbeth's personal history, of her being acclimated to white people because of the time of her infancy without her mother, and that experience shaped her sense of who could be an object of affection. Both came to the conclusion that Lisbeth could perceive human race and gender, and that she specifically loved white men. Alerted to love, I noticed that Lisbeth never spat or threw stones at the very few volunteers who came across as cisgendered men to the site. 10 out of 120 that I encountered, 9 of whom were what we in the US would call white. On the first morning, the white male volunteer, John, started his month of work entering the series of cages in which Lisbeth and other orangutans were held at night. Lisbeth stared intently at the movements of her new interest, following him with her eyes and tilting her head to get a better look through the bars. What does Lisbeth see on the surface of John's skin? Is Lisbeth engaging in racialization with a desire? I don't know. But it points to something about the surface of skin that is felt across differences without even the sense of touch, and that which we might not be able to understand. Michael was an exceptional volunteer. It wasn't just because he was a white British guy who volunteered by himself. One of his legs had been amputated, and he relied on a prosthetic leg from his mid-thigh. He spent his month at the Wildlife Center hammering large metal stakes for the perimeter of an expanded infant orangutan jungle gym area. Beneath the heat of the dry season sun, it would get so hot, his skin so red that Lyung would force him to take a break. The physical shock of driving the stakes into the ground meant that he would sometimes have to remove his leg and tinker with a mechanism, which would completely enthrall the attention of the orangutan bujang. Michael, too, seemed to evoke Lisbeth's interest. I stood watching him hose down the interior while Lisbeth looked in from the outside. She engaged him by gesturing in a way that he understood that he should offer her water. She puckered her lips, repeatedly stuck out the bottom lip, and kept her eyes wide open as she stared at him while he had the hose. Lisbeth's actions conveyed interest, but did it convey desire for engagement? And if it was desire, was it sufficiently quenched with a drink of water? What are Lisbeth's desires, and can we take them seriously? Could we fathom what those desires are? Deferring to the expertise of biology will not help us here. It's not because of the limitations showed by the official expert biologist on staff. Primatologists in particular disapprove of rehabilitation centers and the unique and exceptional behaviors that develop among orangutans in these captive conditions, fostered by humans and sustained on a diet of milk, white bread, bananas, and sweet potatoes. Although primatology and biology can inspire our attention to bodily forms, what I rely on here is an ethnographic attention to the sensations perceived in the experience of a shared moment, and the confusion and miscommunication that lurks in the smells, sights, and sounds that we sense but might not understand. My point is that we cannot force Lisbeth to speak for her actions, nor can anyone offer a definitive explanation of what she is doing or thinking. Instead, we are left with uncertainty and a range of possible stories, some of which are more convincing than others. That does not mean that everything and everybody is indeterminate and uncertain. We certainly know the material conditions of her captivity, the size of her dwelling, the limited range of experiences to which she is exposed, the smells and other sensations to which she is subjected. We may not fully understand how these things are perceived, but we know that these conditions exist. In a direct answer to the question, how can we utilize a transversal perspective amid our present day reality in which right-wing nationalist leaders have come to power, borders have been fortified, and dialogical exchange often seems to be insufficient or even unobtainable? I say we need to stay alert to many forms of evidence that help us piece together stories that are actively prevented from being told. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel Lee. It's a pleasure to be here also in dialogue with Juno. Today I'm presenting this presentation that comes from my artistic research that I've been developing majorly around installations. This presentation that I've been naming Other Than Humans, Other Than You, Other Than Me, in search for attunement with other than humans so they can give me agency to keep existing in this world. I would like to initiate this presentation with my pronouns, they, them, and also my gender identity as a non-binary transgender person. And then my perspective of understanding non-binariness beyond gender. As I see and I have been existing and living in the Western society, we have always been struck with binarities from good and evil, science, religion, male, female. And then this perspective of taking non-binariness beyond gender goes through a bit what I'm presenting today, the topics that I'm referring here. And specifically, I would like to go through all these installations that have been developing in the past years and how in each moment I was perceiving in this in-betweens, the presence and acknowledging this other than humans. Other than humans, I understand them as bacteria, viruses, plants, fungi, animals, entities, deities, the time and beyond. I would like to initiate today with one perception throughout the creation of these installations that I do, which is first silence, in the work that Center for the Living in 2017 in Austria. This work has been developed together with artist Vivian Kakuri, who did the soundtrack of it. In this venue, there were many instances and elements who were changing with time. And then people who would attend the space, we would kindly ask them to leave on the outside any belongings that would remind them of the passage and time itself, like watches, cell phone, shoes, bags. And also we would kindly ask them to communicate inside of the space without words. Today, right now, I'm communicating with this audience who is consisted mostly, I think, majority of humans. And we are talking through voice and also reading if possible, and also using the language in English. I understand it as this Western society is mainly based in their communication throughout the words and speaking. I was quite interested in, once we remove this, how would these other perceptions would be then enhanced. As from coming from my background of education, I am quite interested to ask people how has their experience been like once they been to this installation, these spaces. One thing that was quite interesting for me, that majority of people were telling me the relationship with time, that they were there for 2 hours, but felt like it was 40 minutes, or even the opposite, that they were there for 30 minutes and felt it was a duration of more and more hours then. This experiencing of removing one way that we majorly communicate, and then this amplifying our ways to perceive space and time was quite strong for me, and specifically because of the elements on this installation who were very much bound of change. In this next perception, I talk about smell in this work called Between the Blessed and the Curse in 2017, presented in the Yogyakarta Biennale in Jogja, Indonesia, on the island of Java. This work was a homage to my Brazilian and Indonesian ancestors. And then in this space, I was quite interested in bringing fungi, specifically mold, inside of this space. I collected a few molds and I reproduced them with this sugary water, and then I placed inside of many vessels made of ceramics, terracotta ceramics. And due to the condition of the space, which was quite warm, quite hot, and then with no access of outdoor lights, quite dark as well, a very good conditions for this beans to proliferate, they start to appear. And my initial intention was to create some type of pleasant smell that people would feel as they entered. But for my surprise, what happened was quite the opposite. The venue would have a very strong present stink, and this stink would resemble the smell of human feces. At this moment, which was already very shocking for me, I started to be very interested to stay inside of the venue of the installation and see people's reaction. A lot of people would come in, make sounds of nausea, and instantly leave the space. Other people would take pictures with this very colorful wall selfies. And that scene was quite weird to see this mix between this image of posing and then the smell around it. But one person brought me the most attention. This person entered the space and stayed quite alert, stood still for a long time, looking at the space. And this brought me attention because I also felt that that person was a bit overwhelmed with the diversity of smells that were there. With this perspective, I was more aware of the agency and also these other beings. I had an intent to use them as objects, and they gave me a very clear message that they do what they want, as the smell was not at all the way I expected. For the next topic that I would like to share is around personality and perhaps consciousness in this installation called Queen in 2019, part of the sole exhibition The Negative Years, presented at the Jupiter Artland Edinburgh in Scotland. Queen is a non-binary word coming from a relationship with monarchy, royalty. It's not a queen nor a king. In this project, it was an outcome of 4 years artistic research of mine, 2 years of site-specific research. It's a time-specific and a site-specific installation. And here we developed this bioheater, which is more than 1 ton of plant-based compost who is decaying, rotting to energy. Bacteria and fungi are decomposing this matter and creating, generating heat. This heat we would bring throughout pipes inside of the venue, and then this heat would create the ideal conditions for other beings to develop, such as oyster mushrooms and also molds. Inside of these vases, who have been present in humanity for millennia, we place plant-based organic elements, and then beings around us would appropriate and develop there. Right now, wherever you are, there are invisible to our eyes beings surrounding us, spores, bacteria, viruses, etc. And then they would turn that place into their home. One thing that was quite interesting for me with this slow research, understanding the way I could perceive the existence and the communication of these other than humans. If the compostier was demonstrating their presence throughout heat, the fungi were demonstrating for myself throughout the expansion of the white matter of the mycelia or the presence of the mushrooms. And the same thing relating with the mold around the ceramics, and more specific as well, the smell of it, the change of atmospheres. But in this, I bring a specific situation that happened to me. This whole exhibition took me around 40 days to assemble. Everything was handmade, everything very artisanal, me and a group of people. And every time I was developing the installation queen inside of the space, already with this mycelium developing of oyster mushrooms, I was fine, feeling fine, no reaction whatsoever. Remind me again that this work was already having a recognition of their existence, having them as protagonists, having these other than humans as the collaborative participants of this exhibition. As I am there, the creator of the show, Claire Freely, arrives and asks me to talk about this process and talk about this creation. As I talk and I talk about the ideas, the quality of the air changes. The air gets thick. I feel my throat closing like something is choking me. And at that moment, because I have been approaching mycologists and having conversation and also seeing the development on this sacs of the mycelia, I know that the quality of the air is changing because these other than humans were releasing spores in the air. As the air got thicker and thicker, it was not much more possible to stay in that place, and we needed to leave. In that moment, I start to think about consciousness and personality. Were the conjunction of these other than humans, who I could even not classify all of them, the bioheater, the fungi, the mushrooms, the mold, were creating some type of conjunction collectiveness? Was that type of message that I was not able to be there anymore when I became the protagonist talking about the work, was some type of demonstration of their personality, a personality that now I relate with the name of the installation, queen, a royalty. And from this and other experience that I felt in that space, I felt very much as a vessel, like a employee of the work as well. For the next work, I'm going to talk about relationship and grieving in the work Non-Negotiable Condition in 2021, presented in Berlin, Germany. This work is a site-specific and time-specific, presented in a former power plant in Berlin. 2021 was a year in grieving for me, as I mourned the death of my father, Lee Leon King, who had died from COVID-19. COVID-19 as coronavirus, as a virus who is also a invisible other than human. Throughout this year, I developed some works and practices thinking grieving as an act. As well as in the other works, the presence of these elements that were changing throughout time were here as well. The one thing that I think is quite interesting with the works and the relationship with these works, that once they open and they start, I feel that it's kind of like a funeral / maternity. Once we attend a funeral on a Western tradition, we see the body, we give the first cry. But then the experiencing of the death, it's not only in that situation. That situation, everything is quite fresh. As time goes by, we perceive the grieving. Same thing is with maternity. When we see a recently born baby, that baby doesn't have those features of their personality and physical traits yet. And then as months go by, we start to perceive who this person is. Same thing here with the exhibition. When they open, they also have this freshness. And then as time goes by and all these elements start to be activating, living, dying, decaying, presenting themselves, it's also a way to realize who are they and this collectiveness as a entity. Then I started to relate as well with this process of grieving. Like for instance, this moment right now that I'm talking to you all, this one-on-one, I'm here right now. And once we die, this one-on-one experience is not possible anymore. But yet we still have technologies that we can capture this moment. Right now, with this conversation being recorded, I'm talking through our voice. You can take notes, you can have a memory, photographies can be taken. And furthermore, we can carry throughout memories our affection. Then I start with this condition as well, that every installation that I develop, they're also in this way. They're not going to be reproduced. They're not going to be reassembled. And even if somebody or someone tries to reassemble them in the same place, the entities who were living there, they're not there anymore. They change. So in this sense, I start to think about, as I could attend weekly this installation and see the slow changes, how this will configure as a relationship as well. Not a relationship with human to human, but a relationship with human to these others. And then for my final point, I bring Rotten, Breaking the Binary, Unnamed Entities, 2021, present in the new museum until June 5th now in New York, my first solo in the USA. If we look to a fruit or something that we eat on a daily basis, and then we see the presence of mold inside of this on the surface of these fruits, we might relate this to an image of death. We might think that that's not proper anymore of eating. And before, we might have related that with life, that fruit would nourish us, give us life, keep existing. And in this way that I'm describing this experience, very binary between life and death, and seeing rottenness, seeing mold as an image of death. If we take a closer look and a careful look to this fruit, actually the opposite is happening. More entities, more beings are developing and presenting themselves in the surface. They're alive, they're there. So when we are looking to this fruit, actually we're seeing more life. This in between of life and death that I consider rottenness as, I think it's a state that is very disruptive, yet a condition of existing, like dying is a condition of existing as well. But yet this Western hegemonic society that we live in makes it into a taboo and marginalizes it. This in-between, I think, it's quite interesting experience that breaks this duality, breaks this binarity, but also I don't consider it as a third, as something that is staying still, but also something that is constantly moving and shaping. Here in this exhibition, all the elements are changing through time. Flowers are drawing, decaying. This long structure that I call the members are sprouting seeds and also presenting the fungi, and also the fungi is being developed there. This curcuma, turmeric dyed yellow flags throughout the presence of the daylight that enters fade out with time. And the whole proposition of experience with the spaces is to be there, to perceive that. And what does that cause us to want? When I attend the installations after they are full in development and all these senses are acting, living, dying, rotting, I become a spectator as well. As I am in those spaces and this presence, which is quite unique to myself, I wonder how this cohabitation and co-living with them can give me agency of existing in this world, this relationship, seeing these changes, perceiving that every time I go there, something exists. And also I am understanding that this is my individual experience and somebody else is gonna have their own experience relating with this expanded senses and feeling this space. Furthermore, I also think that it's important to trust the mystery. And this is something that I always rely on. That the changes are always happening and something mysterious is gonna happen. What I'm experiencing in this space is my own experience. but I'm also experienced because I am attuned, I am cohabiting, and furthermore respecting the existence of these other than humans. I'm very curious to also understand and listen to other people's experience. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Juno, so much for these beautiful, beautiful presentations. For the audience, I'm Madeline Turner. I'm the former Cisneros Institute Research Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art. Bing, would you like to say hi? Briefly, I'm joined by my colleague, Bing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bing, and I'm currently the CMAT Asia Fellow. And just very quickly, I would just, on behalf of our entire team, I just want to thank everyone who's made the event possible. Jay, Carson, the AV team, all of the speakers, all of our group leaders, and our amazing departmental manager, Marta Dancy.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a bit of time for some conversation between Daniel and Juno, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. So please, to everyone joining us, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I just wanted to open to Juno and Daniel quickly. There's just so many beautiful parallels between your work. I'd just like to pull some of those threads out before we get talking. I think this idea that comes up between both of your thought processes of communication beyond language and what happens in interactions once we remove language from the equation, these other forms of communication. Also, I was thinking a lot about how you both touch upon, I think one of the most obvious connections are relationships with more than humans, other than humans, whether they be viruses, fungi, orangutans. And through these kind of discussions of relationships with more than humans, you both bring up how we can reformulate binary perceptions of gender, which I think really flourishes so unexpectedly in both of your research. One kind of divergence, perhaps, or difference that I noted, and I'd love to talk through this more, is how each of you engage with topics of death in your work. In Daniel's worldview, it seems that death is really this condition of life. They're so intertwined together. And in Juno, you're addressing the topic of death through extinction, which I think, at least in a broad sense, is perceived as such this kind of finite conclusion. I know you get into extinction in a more kind of elaborate way, but this is kind of how we see death coming together. And then finally, Juno, I just loved how you concluded your talk suggesting, responding to the prompt, suggesting that we need to stay alert to many forms of evidence that help us piece together stories that are actively being prevented from being told. And I think, Daniel, that's what you're doing in your work. This kind of this staying alert is so present to these unclassifiable other than humans. So I know we have so much to talk about. We could start with and responding to any of these ideas, or even thinking about the relationship, the way in which you address time in relation to building social relations and communities. So I open the floor to you, and thank you.
Yeah, I was just so impressed, Danielle, with how so many sensations are conveyed, even when it's just a still image, that you just see the forms of life bursting out of the still image that we see of your installations, and I so look forward to getting to New York City to be able to experience it in the flesh. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great also pleasure to me to be here, because also I understand your research so much about this. I feel sometimes that, for instance, this binomial between dehumanizing and humanizing, we know for sure what is dehumanizing. But then my question is, what is humanizing? And also where you stand about these places between all this contradictions of this care and also the communication language. And I felt seen many times reading your book, like, oh, Jonas is talking about the problems with it and what we do with it. So I also thank so much Madeline and Bing for putting us together, because this is also, for me, art is also practice of learning and unlearning, and then having this opportunity to have this moment with you is also super, super good. So thank you so much as well.
Yeah, I was really intrigued, Daniel, by how you talked about being a vessel for the variety of different spores and fungi, the fungi that you work with. And I feel like it shows a different relationship to this thing called nature, that that there's this assumption that we control it, we cultivate it, but you and I are very much on the same page that we do not. But I'm curious, like, when your first moments were working with the substance, with the spores, like, for you, it doesn't seem like it was an act of cultivation. It wasn't, like, I'm curious about the mistakes that started your process, like, yeah.
There's the thing about like trusting the mystery in each work. That was something that was completely blowing my mind in the process of making, or as the time would pass by and things were actively changing. And that would be like such a strong experience that would stay with me, and that would kind of like feed the next work. Recently, I've been using the word descendants, like each installation is the descendant of the next one, in this slow research. Initially, I was very interested in the passage of time. So and also in each work, I was also revising my ethics. So there was a moment I was putting fruits and vegetables decaying in this space. And because of the harsh social conditions of Brazil, and even from my background story, that became very problematic to myself, and that evolved. But then the perception of change, the perception of presence, the perception of this other existence, and also understanding how much our own survival in this planet has been completely related with this. Right now, at the moment, there's a lot of focusing on fungi, this practice of related with my practice, but then again, with the name of this exhibition, unnamed entities, I bring it more wide. There's like things there who I completely don't know who are they. And then with the experience, they also reveal. So as we finish the work, the completion of physical work in the new museum, one of the founders of the new museum told me, "Oh, this architecture was initially developed to be a plantarium." And like, oh, how interesting that I'm having this information now, that after the work is ready, and not before when they invited me to develop that. So for me, it's a way to keep existing in this world, because this human logistic, it's not enough. And then relating with this, and also thinking, then how can I communicate with them? One thing that it's quite interesting to me to have the conversation with you is one perspective that I also think you wrote about. It's like everything we see from this other than humans, it's our human way to perceive, and how we think that they think, how we perceive that they perceive, but we're not completely 100% sure. Because so far at this moment, we haven't developed a full way of a communication as we do, me and you right now, human to human, English to English. But then I've been thinking, well, then maybe there are other ways of communication, that it's not human-centric, it's non-hierarchical. As you said before, like, they've been here, this fungi, for instance, million years ago, and they're going to continue here after we're gone. All these classification stances doesn't matter to them. What is death? What is life for fungi? Or what is gender? They don't make sense. And this way, the way they broke classifications, the way that also when we are, for instance, in the experience of grieving, this idea they were so stiff, and when this experience comes that blew out my own experience of being human, I also think that this whole sense that the maintenance of binarity is extremely dangerous. So relating with them has given me possibility of keeping existing. because there were moments
Yeah.
I did not want to keep existing as a human, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you call it descendants now, because when people think of like descendants and ancestry, it's a heterosexual story of like father,
Oh,
mother, and then grandfather, grandmother. And then it's like a very narrow heterosexual story. But when you look at spores and you look at like the bodies of slime molds, they produce so many different kinds of sex that they don't conform to male, female. They have like slime molds have 726 because of the way that they generate new genetic material, and that new genetic material is what sex is. It's not male or female. And I love that you're reclaiming descendants away from this heterosexual sense of family that people assume is underlying, this.
and you know, like also in this, so sometimes like, okay, I'm trying to figure out ways that we can communicate with these others, but also in a non-hierarchical way.
Yeah,
So pretty much this like how they can give me agency. I'm not giving them agency.
yeah,
But there's something like, okay, if you're communicating, what is the purpose of this communication? Or what is the message? You know, and then you that have been so much developed, you having put so much effort in this communication between species and us and these others. And so much about, as you mentioned, like this one specific orangutans who were throwing you things.
yeah.
That is, I see, that is an act of communication. And there was like, there was a message there, and also how you were perceiving that. Well, with this other specific person, it was very different, you know. Does this make sense? Like, I wonder, like, what is the message so I can keep existing, you know? And then when you're talking about non-existing, extinction, and also decolonizing that in the sense that how to continuing, and also when you mentioning Donna Harry about, for instance, for me, it's very strong. Only the title, like staying with the trouble, you know, that changes so much the perspective and then position about dealing with something. So you're, let's deal differently with distinction. Let's deal
Yeah.
differently with this communication. But then there's still something that I'm trying to formulate here, but there's something this open as that for me is a search, but more like how to relate them, you know.
Yeah.
Does could you
Well,
share with me a bit your
well,
experience?
I see extinction not as, well, I see extinction as part of life in the way that death is part of life. So yeah, there is a finitude to it, but there's also this recognition that death surrounds us, and it's that, God, I can't even remember the argument of my book. It feels so long ago. But yeah, the main point for me is that um, in this space of instead of trying to revive a species by forcing it to reproduce, what are the ways that we can continue to live together, knowing that the conditions of in which these orangutans are forced is leading to their death. So it's really the decolonizing part is about the intersubjective, interpersonal relationship between people and orangutan. I said interpersonal. I feel like, and it's not just because these are orangutans and they're special, but it's that there's a built social relationship, and it recognizes personhood in that the act of relating recognizes personhood. And that is not like to see an orangutan as a person doesn't always have to mean that it's like somebody imposing their ideas of like a family of man to that other being. Like among Iban folks, there's this history of recognizing orangutans as ancestors, and that those kinds of things you don't really like, you can't really understand, because it's yeah. So anyway, sorry, it's like too many words to have to say this.
Yeah, but I think it's quite interesting. Could you tell me more about this, like recognizing this other as person, because sometimes I feel
Yeah,
like using this other than human and breaking this hierarchy,
yeah,
how it's important that for instance, the other day, a fly was
yes,
around me, and I thought this is also the world of the fly.
Yes.
It's not only the world of the humans, it's
Yes.
the planet of the flies as well that I'm living in.
Yeah.
But then that was perception for me, was a bit like bringing this equality, you know, like, oh,
Yeah.
this that has completely right of existence as I do.
Yeah.
But is that me recognizing the fly
You know,
as a person?
I feel like I'm going to say something controversial, which is, I think there are hierarchies in that if we pretend they don't exist, what that does is pretend that everything is equal and valid, and that's not true, you know, and that works with like fake news and weird conspiracy theories that are proliferating, you know, like saying like the nonsense that comes out of the mouth of so many Congress people in the US, you know, or like the lies, the outright lies that are generated that support, you know, like support these dictators, those emerging dictators. That so that's part of the problem, but also that there is a hierarchy when you engage another being that's not a human, and that part of it is putting yourself in a vulnerable position to recognize that the hierarchy is not working in the way that you think it would. So for instance, knowing that we're vulnerable to these very small beings, you know, like whether that's like viruses or like communicable diseases, that what that shows us is that there is a hierarchy, but it's not the one that we think it was. It's not that humans control everything. It's that we're actually in another kind of hierarchy, where it's actually viruses that are controlling everything. You know? And part of the hope of engaging with others is that you disrupt hierarchies and you establish other kinds of connections that, you know, there's never a way to perfectly meet another person that you're in the same plane, you know, that, or like, and I say person very broadly, like it's really, it takes a lot of work to try to make a social relationship such that all of the differences are erased and that a hierarchy no longer exists. There is some kind of hierarchy, but we work to mitigate against the inequalities that make it so that we can even have a connection, you know, like that there are inequalities and that we work to try to build something amidst so many different kinds of inequalities, because fundamentally, if there's difference, there has to be inequalities, because there's no, it would mean to have like a non-hierarchical space and to have perfect equality means that there's no difference, you know, and because there's so many different kinds of differences, then it's more acknowledging that there's probably multiple hierarchies at stake, you know, and that we're just navigating between so many different inequalities and forms of uncertainty, you know, that like, it's not just a simple hierarchy of who's in power. There's a range of different elements, and sometimes it's just hard to make a judgment of which element is more important than the other, you know, like Lisbeth the orangutan is in captivity, so, but you know, she certainly has the power to show her displeasure to me, you know, like she's stuck there. So that's like certainly a hierarchy I cannot change, you know, that I still have the ability to move around. She does not.
Can I jump in with a question from the audience that I think actually relates nicely to this conversation? So they're wondering, you know, and I think Juno, you touched on this in talking about, I think at one point in your presentation, you mentioned, you know, you could never know what Lisbeth was really thinking. And it kind of brings up the like limits of empirical science. So this question is about how do each of you, if at all, incorporate this kind of empirical Western science or reject it in your work? Yeah,
gosh, that's like the burning question for me right now, because on one hand, I see that science, is the form of power and hierarchy, and like a colonial hierarchy and colonial destruction, especially as it folds into capitalism and just takes things. Like scientific forestry is like the prime example. To understand the forest was really meant to just exploit the forest. So yet at the same time, science is a form of potential liberation. When we talk about like all these like 720 sexes of a slime mold, what we're hoping is that it affirms our like non-binary embodiments. It is like, it's something to treat with ambivalence, where science and what we know will change over time. So you can't be like trust the science, and that line, trust the science, is used to like make like to impose wills on people and impose orders on people, so it's one that like, that's why like when I write, I try to do this where I say biologists say instead of this is, so what we really see are just narratives, that this is a narrative based on evidence, that biologists say that this happens based on these findings, but we'll see how it changes over time.
I fully agree with Juno as well. I think today I was talking a lot about the creative process and the narratives around the work, but then majorly what I'm proposing and that the work's proposing is that it's more a non-verbal experience. You enter the installations and you have your relationship with that. The symbology is quite open. You see this vase, that something is happening, you feel the smell. That smell is gonna communicate directly with you, with your experience or not. So that's the whole effort of it. And what I share today in this process of it, a lot of it was actually coming from mistakes, and this whole, and then dancing with it. Once this appeared to me, it was so more interesting that the goal I had, I didn't stay with the idea like, okay, let me figure out how to make this space smell good, and that was a completely failure. Perhaps that would be the approach with this type of thought, like, and still concentrating in making the space become perfumed. But that was so more interested. That was a mistake. That was the chance. And then I start to also relate with the micro relationship with the macro relationship. That's very much connected. Thinking about the small structures to the larger one, or also even from narratives. It was a mistake why my family from Indonesia ended up in Brazil. They were going to Canada, but then Canada closed borders and they ended up there as one of the first Indonesian families to be in Brazil. So, and that, if that didn't happen, I wouldn't exist. So the thing is, I think more and more it's important for me to say that I'm coming from an artistic research. And then this artistic research is very interesting for me because it can relate with so many fields of art, but more specifically, I'm communicating through aesthetics. And that's where the whole effort of the work is at. And today I'm just sharing a bit the narratives, from a very human perspective. But once you go there, I can't control and I don't want to control. And what one experience, it's quite actually the opposite. I am completely curious for people to bring me their information, how they feel the space, and not me, the one who carries the information and owns the information and share with others. It's very much interested in the process of learning, learning.
Yeah, I think, Juno, I want to go back to that point. I mean, there was so much to comment on, and I just feel like there was such a stream of conversation. There was something that you mentioned about, the differences, and I feel like in your book that something that really stuck out to me was that you wrote that decolonizing extinction requires us to let go of the aspiration for a safe inequality. This certitude, right? Primatology, biology, science. And I just thought of also before, like data feminism, like what doesn't get counted doesn't count, So it is this kind of aspirational data sets and statistics. Mm-hmm. And I think going back to like why this conversation has been so fruitful for all of us is that, Daniel and you write from this perspective, or create from a perspective of sensorial, emotional, affective, and that's what I feel like anthropology can do, is to have a perspective that talks about the things that don't usually matter.
Yeah.
But maybe, I guess, I'm just very mindful of time, but I just feel like I wanted to also say that as a kind of
Yeah.
prompt.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because science is designed to sterilize those feelings and sensations, and that, but like Daniel and I both have this interest in the experimental parts of science, it's like science without the sanitary emotions, like the exciting experimental parts where you're figuring out things, but knowing that there's many paths that can happen out of this, out of these engagements.
One maybe also controversial question. Do you also see science as a belief system?
Yes, God, believe in, like, what is it? Like, there's these posters all around, like, trust the science and believe. This house believes in science. Yes, totally. And it's like a secular religion.
It's a rationality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And
I don't want to invalidate it. Just like also we believe in money, and then it's like a system created around a number, and then from that belief we structure so much,
Yeah.
I was gonna say as well, Danielle, that we believe in things like religion, and these are all like frameworks, right? But they're not necessarily mathematically or statistically finite things. But I think that's a great thing about your work when you talk about these. Other than humans, it's not a kind of categorical thing. Yeah, I just wonder also if there are any closing ideas. I mean, I don't want to close it. We don't want to close it. This will continue, but I just wonder also, in the interest of like today, Madeline, I wonder if you have any.
No, I think we should close because we have another panel starting in 10 minutes. I hate to end the conversation, but perhaps, I don't know, I think we do have one question here from the audience about how, that I think is a great question, maybe something just to sit with briefly. That, thinking about fungi, mold, microbes, material, physical transformations, these are all things that museums have been historically fighting against in preserving their objects. So in this context of, being with MoMA, to think about how you think institutions could change or evolve in the light of the work that you are doing.
Yeah.
So the New Museum exhibition was the first time I did a work in a museum, and I always knew that a lot of museums who are actively thinking about conservatorship, they would have a very difficult relationship with what I do. But with the New Museum, was the first time we did it in practice, and which I thought was a very good moment to bring it to more horizontality, because as we were doing the process, and Bernardo Mosquera, who is the creator of the show, was very much involved with the process. Because of the condition of the new museum, heat control, air humidity control, and that's all for the sake of preserving the arts, and conservation is very much anti-life, anti-change. One night we needed to do a process of putting mud in these members, and it's important that they dry out with 2 nights or even 3 days. And then one night it all dried out, and that for me was very scary, because it felt like that perhaps this is not going to work here. And then I started to perceive that those conditions, they are extremely harmful for this type of work. But plus, I also started to think that it's not only me bringing an invitation for these other than humans to live and make that space into a home, but also it's also the role of the institution itself, because the institution is providing the space and the conditions for it. So it's more a conjoint effort for them to be there. What I do is also an invitation. I invite this fungi to come and exist there. And if they come and they appear, I'm very happy, because they accepted the invitation and they're showing me possibilities of what. It's also not, I think it's important to bring the word invitation, not I place them there, because it's up to them, you know.
Mhm.
And also the recognition. This was only possible inside of the museum because the lobby gallery was the only one who had a very individual heating control system. But what we needed to do is like every day somebody needed to feed with water the installation, which is something that I'm completely every installation tried not to have. The human effort is just this initial of installing, and then the work is independent. But with this act, I start to think this is quite interesting within the context of an institution. If the institution is trying to make the whole space anti-life with this architecture, which is towards conservatorship, then this work is requiring of a human use, of a human to go there every day and nourish it. It's a bit, I have this opposite image of this conservatorship and then what this work required for somebody to go there every day, which I completely thank people there for this type of care. But I think that's interesting because it kind of like relates a bit with Juno's, you know, like what is this thing about caring for this work when sometimes this work can be completely stinky, you know. Even like also in institutions, how you also have someone who is taking care of the artwork and usually present there for other people to not touch it. And I was like, is this person going to be inside of this venue all the time? Because there are some moments that the mushroom is going to be fully active, releasing spores. Sometimes it's going to be very stinky, and I don't think this is nice. You know, I think the experience is good to be there for a while, but not every day with that. So
Mm.
it stays, it becomes problematic. You know, of this creation of this ambience and the space. It's alive. So I think also with what Juno does is like, as you said, like with the orangutans who either needed to go back to the forest or to go to a path of forest procreation. And then this person who's taking care of this orangutan is like, I really hope that you go to the forest, but it's all depending on chance.
Yeah.
And a bit goes with it. That's also why I'm classifying the things that I do, the relationship them as entities, and how I'm relating with them as entities, and then how we are relating, taking and extending an invitation
Yeah.
a bit. Yeah.
Juno, would you like to add anything to that before we close?
No, thank you so much for
Okay.
this. This is such a
Okay.
pleasure.
Thank you both so much. It's
Thank you
really
so much.
been
Thank you
a
so
joy
much. What a
to
pleasure.
speak with you. To our audience, we will begin panel 2 with Nena Okori and Dayara Tucano in just about 3 minutes. So we'll take a brief pause and get started. And thank you again, Juno and Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the second panel of this year's CMAP seminar. I'm Smooth Nzewi, a curator in painting and sculpture department at MoMA, and the Africa group leader within the CMAP research initiative. The theme of the second panel is cycles and reclamations, and it focuses on the relationship between art and social engagement in connection to ecological crisis and territory disputes. The panel raises this set of questions. How do practitioners, artists, scholars, or activists draw attention to environmental concerns by transversing professional and cultural silos? When working with the subjects of land and sea, how do creators engage with politics to call attention to the myriad adversities we endure? And what kind of creative encounters can be proposed as solutions? Our two speakers on this panel bring incredible insights to these questions based on their practices. The first speaker, Neno Kore, is a professor of art at North Park University, Chicago. She's an artist, researcher, and teacher who uses artistic practice, pedagogy, social engagement to respond to ecological issues. She collaborates with the scientific community and audiences in raising ecological awareness. And for our recent delicate sculptures and large-scale installations, Okore has embraced bioplastic as a medium and a call and response methodology as a means to enliven interactions between materials, minds, bodies, research, and documents. Our second speaker, Diara Hori Figueroa Sampaio of the Tucano indigenous peoples, is an artist, activist, and educator who researches the right to memory and truth of indigenous peoples in Brazil. Diara's practice insists on persistence of insurgency, resistance, civil and climate disobedience, and claiming the narratives of indigenous peoples to redress the repression of indigenous histories over time. In probing terms of engagements and limits of terminology through her work, Diara draws attention to territory as both material and immaterial, cultural and spiritual, but tied to specific cosmovision. Our speakers will each explore a shared concern in fostering our collective participation, building alliances, nurturing the environment, and addressing ecological concerns by drawing upon indigenous forms of knowledge. They'll speak about their methodologies that combine or seek interconnectedness between land, territories, materials, communities, human and non-human bodies. They will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes about their recent works. This will then be followed by a conversation moderated by Nancy Dantas, the CMAP Africa Fellow, and Madeline Turner, former Cisneros Institute Fellow and former CMAP Latin America Fellow. I'll now turn it to the speakers. Thank you.
I think my video has to be started by one of the administrators from that end. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. And thank you, Smooth, for that beautiful introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here today with Smooth and Nancy and Madeline and Diara. And thank you, the guests for and the audiences for joining us today. So though my works have spanned different mediums, stylistic approaches, and research interests over the years, I will focus mostly on my current practice, which addresses waste issues through an African call and response ideology. As an artist, my practice combines creative and pedagogical frameworks that support art making, learning, and awareness building in an ecological context. In other words, my works embody ecological models, concerns, as an approach to teaching about ecology. And drawing on William McDonough's Cradle to Cradle, I advocate for using my materials to visualize ecological situations and contributing to the solutions by creating works that generate less waste on the environment or impact on the environment. So most recently, I have been making what is called bioplastic. It's a kind of food-based plastic material as a way of reducing my carbon footprint. And I also try to engage in transformative and productive, public or social engagement with people as a way of having these conversations and also drawing from the provocations, calls, and responses that my participants put forward in the knowledge making and ad making process. So to that end, I've mostly been working with materials objects that are very informative in terms of the way that they contribute to ecological discussions. And I've been specifically working with bioplastic. In the next few slides, I'll show how I've approached the waste issue and learning through a call and response philosophy. And I will particularly illustrate this by talking about the New Yam Festival and the call and response ideology that is transmitted through that. And I'll read from an excerpt of something I wrote earlier this year. When I was about 5 years old, I attended my very first New Yam Festival in my indigenous hometown of Otutu in southeastern Nigeria. I still recall the energetic scenes of this environment. I recall that in every corner of the village square, a group of women danced in circular formation, chanting to a song as they clattered two shaved sticks together to the rhythm of their chants. Surrounding them were community members, comprising mostly women, youth, and children, who swayed to the rhythm and would occasionally break into the orbit of the circle to dance, clap, and sing along. Not too far away, another group of men assembled and conversed between themselves. I could see young men carrying freshly harvested yams from nearby farms to a fire where it will be roasted. Even then, the activities were not divorced from the women who were singing. They occasionally chanted to the tunes and also were slicing the yam and fanning the flames at the same time. Close by, children could be heard screaming and darting around in every direction as the great Ekbo masquerade approached with the drummers. My dad would explain to me later on that these masquerades were an embodiment of the community divinity. He explained that though its oversized mask was done by an imposter, it represented the deity of our people. The festivity reached its climax when a group of elders summoned the community together to break the kola nut, which is a special kind of nut that is seen as food for the living ancestors and the gods. Together, the elders poured libation. They called on their predecessors and the spirits of the land, trees, water, and skies to offer gratitude for yet another bountiful harvest that will sustain the community for the rest of the non-planting season. So in this excerpt, I'm not necessarily trying to romanticize my childhood. Rather, it's about showing how African concepts of call and response is enmeshed in the lives and experiences of the Igbo people. And for the Igbos, call and response is not a means to an end, but it's a way of life. It's a way of being in the world. It's about building alliances with human and non-human entities. As a concept that has existed over a millennia in the lives of Africans, call and response promotes growth through sacred rituals, spirituality, and interactions. So basically, my work is rooted in this ideology, and it is the belief that everything is interconnected: people, objects, environment. And the African sense of community is grounded in intersections of self, materialities, and immaterialities, such as songs, food, dance, rituals, and bodies. And let's not forget that the African indigenous practice of call and response considers these kinds of human to non-human relationship long before the Western scholars had popularized them, naming them the new materialism and post-humanism. So for me, call and response is highly effective in creating and addressing ecological awareness, especially because it provides an awareness for people, materials, and spaces in a learning circulation. By recognizing that all these entities that involve non-living things have material forces and physical agency, my call and response approach builds on social engagement that involves working with people, creating provocations, responding by doing, art making, and embedding learning in other experiences and contexts. While working with food waste from my kitchen helps me to talk about the larger issues. By engaging other people in my process, I also encourage them to think about how waste can be rechanneled or transformed within their domestic spaces. Engaging with bioplastic and the participants inspires different methods for me to shape, construct, and display my bioplastic in terms of the color and the installation. In working with bioplastic, I'm prompted to consider how I leave an ecological mark that I can delight in and not lament on. As such, I interrogate how I use materials so that it can be returned to the natural cycle without harming the environment. These are some of the first bioplastic experiments that I created with the bioplastic in the early stages. And especially because COVID and the lockdowns had interfered with my creative process, I had no choice but to engage with the outdoor settings. And so I was creating works outside, interacting with the trees, the birds, and the rodents, and trying to find agency in their engagement to see what the potentials were. So they became my participants. And as the works developed, I began to create physical maps from my urban food waste to draw out some of the connections between land, territories, bodies, and waste. Drawing on historical and geographic atlases, I elicited calls and responses, dialogues from participants online. In this series, I reference bushes, mountains, rivers, borders through imagined lines that are being traced out on the surface of the map. And there are also tributaries, landmarks, and watermarks that are created with HANA. By placing the bioplastic maps against the suburban view of my home, I underscored how the waste problem is eating into the urban landscape and redefining the planet through a spell of climatic catastrophe that is triggered by capitalism. Inscribed on these maps are words like ecology, geology, planets, materiality, Anthropocene, climate change, capitalism, and consumerism. The words brought into play paradoxes between waste and territory, waste and body, waste and earthly nourishment, and waste and disaster. Returning to the concept of call and response in my work, my aim with the bioplastic art practice is to engender learning and ecological awareness through social material practice with bioplastic. These are the works that resulted from a social engagement. In the process, I responded to participants' calls to paint with the bioplastic and make transparent things with it. In one of the engagements, participants suggested that I create work for the non-human audience, which means nature. And I followed that lead and created these circular forms with plantain peels that I put outdoors. It gave me pleasure to leave them outside knowing that the works will do no harm to the environment. It comes from nature's rejects and can be composted and returned to nature's cycle. This piece, Atmospheric Nature, was created in response to a call by some of the online participants to explore the translucency of the bioplastic. Taking up the gallery space and the shoulder-to-shoulder placement of these suspended fabrics created smaller pockets of space between them that participants could walk through. It produced a maze-like experience for the audiences. And between the transient plastic panels, it encouraged viewers to become with the piece through a heightened awareness of their bodies as they moved inside the weightless forms. These next slides are just some of the results of the other works that were inspired by audience engagement and participations. This is illustrative of the powerful potential of artworks to have, to interrogate a problem, visualize an issue, and be part of the solution. In summary, by expanding the possibilities and riches of learning through visceral engagements with ecological issues, the African-inspired column response takes a step further to decenter Western material practices by offering indigenous ways of engaging in the world with human and non-human forms. And also, given that the column response ontology is about maintaining a sense of balance, spirituality, and community among people, I see the benefits of positioning this column response in my practice as a critical means of catalyzing dialogue for decolonizing how we think about and approach ecological problems. I would like to end by sharing this site-specific installation that I created last year. And while it's not directly connected to my bioplastic works and research, it resulted from an extensive remote engagement, online engagement with the people of Bruges in Belgium. The piece is titled, "And the World Keeps Turning." It draws its inspiration from architectural environment and the lace-making tradition of the local women in Bruges. The installation was specifically designed to transform the medieval tower and draw attention to post and past colonial histories, current global issues, and the anthropogenic turn. That will be it for me. Thank you.
Hello. I'm really nervous to be here at the moment. So I'd like to present myself. I am Dayara. I am from the Tucano indigenous people. We live in the border between Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, in one of the last corners of the Amazon rainforest. And we are one of the more of 300 indigenous peoples at least still live in Brazil. And I am an artist. I have a graduation in visual arts, and I did a post-graduation in human arts, where I approached the right to memory and truth of indigenous peoples. That is an issue, and I think my whole work throughout really relates to this issue with memory and truth. Because we have so many things to say as indigenous, and so many things to confront before Western view of history and how they present us, and etc. So we always say that indigenous time is really different from the non-indigenous, and I'll try to just talk to you. I am not doing any image presentation because these thoughts I have been walked by the last years have really taken my mind. So I'd like to talk about some of the challenges of indigenous art and indigenous artists by 3 little steps. Like the first is, how are the indigenous presented and treated and represented in art history, in Western art history? What is the place, how is indigenous art presented treated in Western art, and what is happening with contemporary indigenous art today? And well, I actually need a little more time to talk about it, because you know, people really really few about indigenous peoples in the Americas or indigenous peoples all over the world. And the way Western art and the museums and schools and books present indigenous are really often really superficial and well, marked by a colonial point of view, and with very racist elements, as for example, how we were for so long inferiorized and treated as less human beings or savages or uncivilized. And art is a platform of and a media that works to build the narratives of colonization as well. So it's understandable that when these Western institutions, as the museums and the schools and universities and academies, still replicate that forms of violence until today. And it's something that is really structural to them, and that we need as indigenous spend lots of time to explain the many degrees of violence that we find in those spaces. And maybe one of the more violent ones is this construction of an artificial image of the Indian. That is a Western image that we don't specially relate to all the time, because before recognizing ourselves as Indians or indigenous, we belong to nations, we belong to peoples, we have a history of creation, we have languages, we have memories, we have truths that are all the time diminished by Western society. And another challenge is how the indigenous art is treated in Western institutions. Like everybody knows that the museums were born with cabinet de curiosité, where the museums were born by this amusement of exotism, and indigenous communities still suffer with that kind of racism, in the way that our art, our expressions, our cultural expressions are really often interpreted in a really ethnographic way, or ethnographic classifications. We are put in a context that is very often in the past, like oh, the indigenous peoples lived like that, like and that make us feel like as we were ghosts, living ghosts today, as we didn't exist in the nowadays, but we were always contemporary. We are still here, and we didn't we went fully extincted, or we didn't disappear. We still walk in an effort of resistance and not forgetting who we are. And so this ethnographic museological way of representing indigenous art, classifying or putting us away in time, or dividing our knowledge by other classifications as the materials, for example, I don't know, the clay, the feathers, the woods, whatever. is a very complex logic of non-recognition of the complexity of our identity and contexts. I don't know if I am speaking well. I am not an English speaker, so sorry if you have any doubts. Please interrupt me or correct me. And well, in front of those challenges, I am part of a generation of indigenous artists that are standing all over the world. Is really something that is happening now, and some call indigenous contemporary art as a generation of artists that are reacting to those frictions and the trying to dialogue and to respond in the necessary ways to these Western institutions and find our paths to express our identity, our memory, our context, our culture, and our cosmovisions. And when I say cosmovisions, and I'd like to thank the presentation, because, well, you explain it. I think you explain it well. Like, cosmovision is the way we understand the world around us, is the way that we understand the universe and reality. The guys in the table before use a word, but I don't really remind this in English. Is a science statement, is an epistemology, is how we understand what is real and what is truth, and well, how we see the universe around us. And we are lately talking very much about the climate changes, and well, you know, we are humans and our history is full of violent memories, but actually in our generation as well, we are facing really drastic and dramatic an ecological crisis with climate changes and other aspects and ecological issues. And in the middle of all of that, one of the truths that is recognized by science and politicians, and not really the industries, but a scientific truth, is that indigenous territories are a very important last stand of the biodiversity in this planet. More than 80% of this planet's biodiversity still lives and still exists, still resist in indigenous territories, in indigenous lands, and that is possible because indigenous peoples are fighting to protect those territories, and indigenous peoples still reaffirm our relation to these living beings that is so respectful that we cannot even imagine existence without them, without what we call nature. And so at this moment, the indigenous issue is really important, because if we want to keep living, to keep life existing on this planet, we must relearn as a humanity. We must relearn to relate to nature and to life in a different way that was the Western colonial way. And so, okay, that is a big ethical and philosophical challenge. But what about the indigenous artists? Well, we are, I am trying to survive and not to get totally crazy, because I found myself in this really complex situation and in front of very different interlocutors, trying to dialogue with especially three big groups. And the first big group is the non-indigenous Western institutions. Like we need to try to dialogue, to try to have a more balanced dialogue with the academies, schools, museums, the galleries, and the art markets, and try to explain all the time how to recognize the violence that they replicate even without knowing or without acknowledging, and trying to debate what they call decolonization. That is a very ironic term for us, because I don't know, but in my opinion, the one who decolonize is the colonizer. So if you want to colonize, to decolonize, we really need to recognize the privileges that were granted by a colonial system, and try to reorganize on how we treat other people, and how we stand on this world. And so for me, it's really different, the decolonial thing from the counter-colonial thing, because the colonizer decolonize, and we as indigenous peoples that still resisting another identity, in an originary identity that relates to a thought and a territory that is before the invasion of our land. We just can counter-colonize, not in the sense of attacking back or slapping people, but in the sense of reaffirming our identity and our territories. And our territories is not just the land, because very much was stolen from us, but the territory of thought, the territory of culture, the immaterial territories, and the immaterial beings that are included in those territories. Well, the second interlocutor, the second major interlocutor, that is way more frightening than the Western white people and these institutions, are the relatives, are the indigenous fellows. Because actually, when you are an indigenous artist, we are all the time being observed by our fellows, and we need to explain to them the traps, the dynamics and the traps that we are recognizing in the Western institutions. Because the system, the big system, in Portuguese we say sistemão, o sistemão, the big system, is always pushing us to adapt to the little boxes, and to try to gain power, to defend ourselves. And I don't know if that is real the point. I don't know if this way of if we need to relate or occupy the world in the same way that the Westerns do. As for example, oh, I'm speaking too much, sorry. Well, so we need to recognize the traps of the Western institutions and recognize and reappropriate our practices in our cosmovisions. Is like if we keep explaining indigenous thought in Western ways, that is a big trap. We need to reaffirm our language and our way to speak and our way to understand reality and live our truth, and stop talking about us as anthropologists do, for example. So that can be really, really difficult because our populations, the indigenous populations all over the world, face an extreme situation of violence and marginalization and poverty. And so people need to raise their kids, you know. And today in this world, to raise their kids, they need some money, they need some political assistance. And it's really difficult, for example, when I say that I do some, I have some art pieces that I don't sell, and I will never sell because I have another relation to them that is deeply spiritual, and it's very difficult to explain to my relatives, for example, that our art can be really, really expensive, but that we must pay lots of attentions not to fall into the traps of this capitalism, this monetarization, because the thing is not the money value of what we do, but the spiritual, the cultural value that we are passing away and how we relate to that. So that is really difficult, and so we need to develop different ways and languages to speak to these two interlocutors, the non-indigenous and the indigenous. And but the most difficult of all is the third interlocutor, the universe. Those, as we were talking in the previous table, the non-human beings, really reaffirming our indigenous ways of understanding the world, and then what we are seeing, what we are understanding, and how to survive to this, because we really are in a really tragical moment. And we need to survive to it. We always wanted to survive to it. And so this table is about cycles and reclamations. I believe it's about cycles of memory and truth, to renew the relations with life and the universe. And so I ask myself, and I ask to you, and I ask the MoMA, how are indigenous art represented, presented, and treated, because we need to reevaluate and explore more balanced ways to dialogue to different cultures, understanding that culture is territory, that cultural diversity is richness, is treasure, and that to understand and appreciate and face the actual moment that we are living, the more perspectives we have on life, the best. So epistemologies, cosmovisions are part of these ecological concerns. Maybe the most important point of this ecological crisis is really how we think we understand the universe and relate to this. So that is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Anu.
Thank you, Dayara. Dayara, would you leave your camera on so we can chat? Thank you. Yeah, you're good. Thanks. Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. And Nena, would you like to turn your camera on too? Great, thank you. Thank you, Nena, for your presentation as well. Just quickly before we get started, I think we have a lot to talk about. I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Madeline Turner. I am the former Cisneros Institute Research Fellow, and I'm joined by Nancy Dantas. Nancy, would you like to present yourself?
Hello, my name is Nancy Dantas. Hello, Nena. Hello, Dayara. Thank you for your presentations and your thoughts today. I am the CMAP Africa Fellow, and I just wanted to just quickly say a word of thanks to the fellows for the conversations that we have been having in the lead up to these panels, how we've been thinking together about knowledge and what counts as knowledge and what transversal practices and methodologies might look like, and how we might transform, rebirth, revive, and regenerate our scarred planet and relationships. I think it's really beautiful. I'd also like to acknowledge the first panel and how it's kind of the connections between the first panel and this panel that we're in right now. But mostly so much gratitude to you both for your work.
Thank you. So I think just to kind of get started, we have some time for conversation between Nena and Dayara, guided by Nancy and myself, and then we'll open to questions during the last minutes. So please, to our audience, if you have questions for Nena and Dayara, please put them in the chat and we'll take them. But turning to both of your talks, Nena and Dayara, I think, as Nancy mentioned, there's this really connecting thread throughout the previous panel, and this one about this idea of truth, right? And what is truth, and what truths have been suppressed and not allowed into institutional spaces such as museums, such as MoMA. And I think especially in the context of this seminar, which is taking place through MoMA, it's so important to address the issues and even problems that are being faced around collecting Indigenous art or ecological art when those very institutions, museum institutions, educational institutions, are the ones that have contributed to the oppression of those narratives and have contributed to ecological harm as well. So how can we have these conversations? How can this artwork begin to be incorporated into these collections? Just to point out some kind of intersections between your talks, I think you raise really important ideas around these intersections of various temporalities of past, present, and future, and how these are all intersecting at once, and especially the living traditions. Both of you talked about living traditions. These are not dead traditions. They're very much in the present, very much in the future, but how these living traditions, again, have been repressed or ignored or erased from history by Western culture and institutions, or depicted as something of the past. I also really like this idea of survival and thinking about how to survive in the present moment. You know, both of you, I think the reason why we wanted to have both of you here is because you inhabit so many different roles in one. You are artists, educators, activists. And so I think it would be just nice to start if you could tell us a little more. I think this came up in both of your talks about how you bring together these various roles or understand inhabiting these various roles in one. I know, Dayara, you mentioned that art, kind of you have a very complex way that you relate to the idea of being an artist. So I'd love to hear from both of you about how you, and Nena, you are a professor as well and an educator, so how these all come together in your practices.
I can start. I think essentially I see myself as playing the role of one who is trying to bring together different elements within the living space. Because coming from a background where art was positioned as life, they intersect at every point. And I don't see them as separate things. So being an artist, being an educator, being one who is engaging with the social and non-social environment, it feels like it's all in conversation and it's all instrumental to the ontoepistemology, especially one that Dayara referenced. So for me, I think I anchor a lot of what I do around this idea that I spoke about earlier, which has to do with a call and response. And by that, I don't necessarily mean a one-liner where we're talking and responding, but I'm thinking about the deep commingling, the deep intersectionalities or interactions that are happening across board, the connection with the cosmos, the connection with people, the connection with objects and with the earth. And I think that all those things are interwoven and should not be seen as separate entities. As we talk about colonization, colonialism, and its impact and the destruction of worldviews and perceptions, I think that the colonial mentality has always been one where you are to your own, every man to their own. It's all about my wealth. It's all about my acquisitions. It's all about my ideas and putting everybody at bay. And I think that, in my practice, I try to break down those barriers because we ought to be in an intersecting way. And my African cosmology or ideology believes or promotes the idea of intersections, which means that you always have to be bouncing off different things. You bounce off the people, you bounce off the earth, you bounce off the spirits. It's all that conversation that helps us to have an attunement to the earth. And so when I think about ecology and eco-pedagogy, in my case, where I'm thinking about ecology and pedagogy and how we learn about the environment, again, I go back to the idea that we really have to recognize the importance of who we are as humans and how we are connected to other entities, be it the spiritual entities, the material entities, the immaterial entities, all of those kinds of things, the living and non-living spirits. And so it is for me a very intersecting quality that I think is beneficial to how we understand our earth. If you're not connected to the things, living and non-living things of the earth, you are likely not going to be connected to the problems that we face and how we can solve it. And capitalism, particularly neoliberalism, has really helped us be disembodied from all of these problems because capitalism drives a me position. It's all about me, my family, myself, my race, it's about division. And so we're trying to, through my practice, we're trying to drive an us position, an us including me, you, the cosmos, the living things, the non-living things, the spirits, the heritage that we're coming from, all of those things, our land, our territories, and so on and so forth. So I think I'll hand it over to Dayara. She might have a lot more to say here.
That's wonderful. I totally agree. One of the challenges I faced, I'm speaking in English, trying to speak in English, or here in Brazil, I will try to speak in Portuguese. Portuguese. But well, it's really difficult to express in Western languages, in Western conceptions, what we are really talking about in indigenous ways of view. And so one day, I was talking with a friend, an indigenous artist as well. And he asked me, hey, Diana, how do you say art in your language? And I was, well, what are we talking is art? What is art? What does the Western society, the Western culture calls art? It's not the same thing we call hobby, because we don't have a word to describe what the Western call art, but we have a word that maybe is the closest to relate to the idea of art, that is the vision, like the vision, the spiritual vision, the vision that what you see when you drink ayahuasca, the vision of your dreams, the vision of on how the great grandfathers and grandmothers spirit design nature. Like I once met a really old shaman, like he was 105 years old, and he told me, my daughter, everything is canoe, everything is this vision, everything is the design of the great spirit. So there are indigenous words to describe something else that can be maybe one day the art can approach, and I think it approaches very often. That is this path. This no, it's not a path. This space where we can approach our visions to the universe and dialogue with it. Dialogue in I don't like the word spiritual as well, because it's you have lots of ideas. They think, oh, they're talking spirits. It's not that. But you know, in some ways, in spirituality, when you put apart the little boxes and the divisions that Nena was talking about, we can find a space where we can dialogue above the limitations that were set by those Western languages, by those walls that try to divide our worlds apart. And maybe one of the bridges to that space can be art. Not always, because we have lots of traps, but it can be sometimes. And yeah, I think it's that. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah. I'd like to hear a little more. You mentioned this in your talk too, about these kinds of like traps. I know that's come up several times. I wonder if you'd be open to kind of talking about those traps a little more.
The traps. I think there are always relations or understandings about power. And what is power? The same way we can debate what is art. Maybe art can help us to debate what is power and how are the dynamics of power, of imposition. Power as an imposition, power as physical abuse of force and violence, or power as resistance, power as renewal, power as the strength that the little plant has to go out of the earth, you know, what we understand as power, what we understand as richness. Is it about money or not? So artists are supposed to be famous and rich and are supposed to be recognized when they are being celebrated by rich people at the MoMA, or the Guggenheim or something like that, or the thing is like dreaming about turning into some kind of Picasso or what? And not necessarily, you know. Of course, I think lots of people dream about that because it's something that is like a fable, is like a story tale that was constructed and put into the children book stories and school story and in the university and in the galleries and etc. that we turn to believe in as something that is successful or whatever. But what is the function of the artist? You know, I began hiding what I draw and just showing to my mom. but I for very long time, for me, it was not the point to show my art because it was a space, a very intimate space. And one day it happened that somebody like pushed me and say, no, you're going to show that. And I was like, okay. And then I was really frightened because I needed to show this in the middle of my teachers, like my university teachers. And I was, oh my God, they are so old and powerful. And what the hell I am doing in middle of these powerful references that I have, the references of academy, you know. And well, I began showing and stuff. And by last year, I was at the Biennale of São Paulo, that is one of the great biennales and whatever. And it was wonderful. And at the same time, it was so violent and so tragic to me. And sorry, and I'm still trying to survive that. I have faced, I have many relatives that think that I can be rich or powerful or influent or whatever, and I don't feel like that. We are just trying to give us, well, I am just trying, I can speak for myself, I cannot speak for all the indigenous. But maybe I am in the past to try to I don't know. Hey, you speak Portuguese, Nancy, help me. Sanar, aliviar uma dor.
Heal a pain.
Yeah, it's not like healing, but yeah, like you know, like try to build some comfort in a space where I found myself very often surrounded by spears and ew, the makeup is off, and arrows, because it's really itchy. That system is really itchy. The art system, the art big system, can offer to you that thing that you want to be an artist, money, fame, power, whatever, and that can kill you. And that can let you crazy. It's like if that can eat your soul in a very deep way. If that can eat your relation to the art. And that is what is happening to me right now. I feel really disconnected to my initial relation to the art because of the friction with that Western system. Because of the necessity of having to explain it all the time to the universities and the galleries and the museums and the collectioners, that crazy people, I tell to them that I find them crazy. And that is really exhausting. But by the end of the day, I still want to make to share with my nephews, and I don't know if I will have grandkids someday, but that the initial seed that put me on that path was to reconnect to the memory and to the original relation that my grandparents once had when they were alive. Mm-hmm. And so that confrontation shows the friction between those powers, the powers of the narratives of the institutions, of coloniality and racism and all those violences, and is full of tricks, is full of traps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Diarra. We have a comment in the chat thanking you for being so open and honest about your experience. I know it takes a lot, so I think we really appreciate it. And Nana, we also have a question for you in the chat from one of our audience members. I'm wondering if I welcome you to respond as well to the prompt from before that Diarra was responding to. I'm interested to hear about your relationship with institutions. There's also a question for you about your teaching practice in relation to your work and how one feeds the other, and your choices when you're building a syllabus to embrace science, sensibility, and contemporary art.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge Diarra. Just listening to you is so powerful. Your thing energy, your life force is transmitting to all of us. So I thank you very much for radiating that power to us. And I just want to acknowledge also that I completely resonate with the ideas that you brought forth, which include, the idea of violence and language and power, and how those things have been complicated by this whole colonial experience, and continues to complicate, because I recently was reading an excerpt or an essay by a scholar called Jean Kaira, talking about recreating an Ubuntu, the Ubuntu ideology from South Africa, which is all about, the ideology of that we are because I am, and I am because we are. It's like this whole thing of connectivity, interconnectivity, interwovenness of man, things, and the universe. And so I'm not sure if it was a he or she, but the scholar was talking about this idea of how the imperialist system of education has really positioned knowledge to be about formal education, as opposed to being about the wisdom of culture and the wisdom of the older generation. And talking about how an old woman from a rural environment or an indigenous community sometimes feels less complete because she doesn't have an education. Meanwhile, she has a trove of knowledge, of rich knowledge that is above and beyond what the formal education can provide for us. And so there is power in that. And we tend to give preference and precedence to the academy and not to that cultural institution that has been an age-old system that possesses all the answers to many of our problems and our questions today. And so I really appreciate you for bringing those issues up. I think it's so complicated, and so I wish we had a lot of time to dissect it, because it's so interesting, and I would love to hear more. But so thank you, and thanks for being vulnerable for our sakes. I just want to go back to the question that was posed to me. Thank you also for that question. So I basically look at my teaching practice as an eco-pedagogy. And again, eco-pedagogy really just speaks to this idea that we are learning about the ecology and being aware of it through the lenses of the injustices that have been done to the human agency, and also through the non-human agency. And so when I'm thinking of injustices, I'm not just thinking about, how people have been impacted, but I'm also thinking about like the colonial violence that's happened to people. And so when I'm teaching students, I'm trying to make them aware that capitalism in itself is an injustice, right? And so that is important for them to have at the back of their mind as they go into this practice of art, which Diara would rather not, align with, because it is so Western. But in the art world, art is the creative process. And so when I teach, I'm often opening it up to these conversations about experimentation in terms of science. My syllabus build in many kinds of topics and projects that allow us to reach into some of these topics, uncomfortable topics, especially topics that have to do with, ecology, topics that have to do with colonization and imperialism, topics that have to do with breaking away from the mold and kind of seeing ourselves as human and as diverse and as people that all need to be working together as opposed to adverse to each other. And trying to find ways to really connect with the environment. So a lot of my, the projects that I do in class are outdoor projects. We're outdoors, we're messing with the soil, we're messing with trees and connecting, we're breathing the air, we're sitting outside, we're using materials that are attuned to natural sources, and so on and so forth. And in terms of science, I'm not a scientist, but my approach to art making sometimes has a sciencey feel. And I think that even in indigenous ways of making, there is a way that the way in which science kind of is enabled, although it's not called science, but it is there. The practice of science is there because there are many kinds of, indigenous medicines and indigenous ways of making dyes and all kinds of food practices that are out there that are not classified as science, but they are some scientific processes. And so this is the way that I embrace it. And in terms of contemporary art, I tend to push back a little bit at the structure of contemporary art, because I feel that it is a very superficial structure in the sense that there are circles that kind of build this contemporary art, and it is also based on a history and a lineage of colonialism and imperialism. And so I take contemporary art with a grain of salt. I want to understand it and approach it in my own terms, as in I want to be able to position myself in the contemporary art scene in my own terms, not according to the way that people or the museums have projected. So I bring about these identity, this sense of identity through the works that I create, and I try to make students aware that that identity is important in how we speak to issues of today and how we speak to contemporary art discourse. So I don't want to go too far, but I think that's what I want to say about that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time, unfortunately. I know we wanted to decolonize time in this seminar.
We knew it was sure to happen.
We can take one more question that we have from the audience that I think is kind of a nice way to wrap up. But this question is going back to some of the ideas that were raised in the first panel, which was about topics of care. And I'm wondering if either of you would just be willing to share kind of day-to-day how you take care, how you feel connected to the territory, the land, the earth that is so important in your practice. If there's these kind of like small gestures that you do for yourselves, whether it's like gardening, meditation, if there's anything like that, I think it's nice to hear.
I support 10 sisters and brothers and a very big family. And I am connected to my largest family in the village and etc. Well, no, como que é? Militância. I forgot the name in English for militância.
Militancy.
Militancy? Okay.
Mhm.
I think it can happen in very different spheres, and all the time it's just something you believe in. And practicing our relation to the world is something that we do all the time, even when with the food we eat, or how we say good day, compliment and salutate people. So I don't think it's nothing really different or special. If I would treat it as different, I would be just reaffirming I don't know, this exotism. I do not do anything exotical. I have a family, I am a mother, I am a sister, I have many brothers, I take care of what I can, and I put flour to the hummingbirds on my window. So that's it.
Thank you for sharing that.
I could just add that, already I think having to take time to save all my all my food peels and vegetables, extras that are not edible or not usable within the home. I use them for my art, and I lately I've been also making art that ends up outdoors for the animals and for the plants, and so that is a way that I've also tried to connect with the outdoors, and also connect with nature in general, and be more aware of how art is part of life and should not be separate.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing this time with us. I think, we have many comments thanking you both for being so vulnerable and open and honest in this space. I think that's the most important thing. So I guess in closing, we will thank Dayara and Nena. So thank them so much. And just a reminder to our audience that tomorrow we have panels 3 and 4, and you can find the link to register in the chat. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Call us back.